It's Thursday. It's 11:45. We're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Madeline Grant from The Telegraph, Boris Johnson supporter Theresa Villiers, Times columnist David Aaronovitch and Guardian columnist Dawn Foster. Today, is Labour doing enough to deal with anti-Semitism following claims that Jeremy Corbyn's closest allies try to interfere in the disciplinary processes?
It must have taken great courage for them to whistleblow, and for them to have to call out poor practices, I think, is deeply sad and actually deplorable that we would just dismiss them as in some way sort of disaffected.
But does the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, think his party is institutionally anti-Semitic?
No, I don't. I've just watched the Panorama programme. Some serious charges there. They've been hotly contested.
Staff working for MPs in the Commons face an unacceptable risk of bullying and harassment, including sexual harassment, according to a new independent report. And we'll be discussing how to save Britain's high streets as more and more of us shop online.
Landlords have to get realistic and realise that their assets are going to have to take a hit on the thing to lower the rents to get the people back in.
So all that coming up today in a packed programme, plenty going on in political life and beyond. The question the Panorama programme posed last night was, is Labour anti-Semitic? What's the answer, Madeline Grant?
Well, I think it's pretty clear what the answer is. And I think that the way in which the Labour Party have dealt with the allegations only upholds that further. They have a particular playbook for dealing with these kind of allegations, which is to start by denying everything, smearing the complainants as, disgruntled employees, looking for some kind of technicality in which to let off the allegations, and then potentially throwing in a bit of whataboutery about Tory Islamophobia for good measure. There has been an utter failure to deal with these kinds of allegations, and a failure now to take them seriously. And if you listen to the testimony of some of the whistleblowers last night in the documentary, to not take those seriously, I think, is utterly shameful.
Theresa Villiers, is Labour anti-Semitic?
Yes, on the basis of that Panorama programme, I think it shows clearly that it's... I found it distressing to watch, and it's shocking that this has been going on for 3 years and Labour haven't dealt with it.
David Aaronovitch.
Labour has an anti-Semitism problem, which has emerged mostly as a consequence of the infusion and the coming to power of a far-left segment which has always been incredibly hostile to Israel and which crosses the line in what it takes to be anti-Zionism into the repetition of anti-Semitic tropes, we call them, about Jewish power, money, influence, lobbying and so on, and which has therefore either failed to see what has come in their midst, or actually is quite prepared to tolerate them. Or in the case of some of Corbyn's closest friends, they've been his friends for years and years, and they are the very same people who are being subject to discipline. So there's a really tricky problem there.
Dawn Foster.
I think that Labour does have an anti-Semitism problem, and nobody in the Labour leadership has or will deny that. I don't think it's a problem that has only existed in the past 3 years. I mean, if you look at 2005, to talk about anti-Semitic tropes, as you say, there was the Michael Howard, Oliver Letwin poster that Alistair Campbell put forward, depicting them as pigs. It's been a problem for years, and the number of complaints has risen massively.
Didn't it? The number of complaints about anti-Semitism seemed to grow substantially. The number that the compliance unit had to deal with grew substantially after Mr. Corbyn became leader. Why is that?
I think the number has risen massively.
It has.
I don't have the stats to hand on how many of them have been found out
we can
correctly.
agree it rose massively.
But in 2016, half of the complaints that they were dealing with were from prior to September 2015. There's always been an issue. The biggest issue at the moment, speaking to party members, members of staff working there, it's not being dealt with fast enough.
But in February, Labour's own figures showed there have been 673 complaints of anti-Semitism. by Labour members in 10 months. That's almost 70 a month.
Yes, it is, and they have to be dealt with. Yeah, and they
Why?
They have to be dealt with as quickly as possible. Speaking to
but
staff
why
members.
What I'm trying to find out is why. I mean, many of us thought the anti-Semitism in this country had been pretty much banished. It's at least beyond the outer fringes of the sort of knuckle-dragging right.
I think that's a mistake to think that. But I think the problem is,
why did it come back?
I think the problem is that there is...
On the left?
The problem is there isn't one reason. There are all sorts of reasons.
Well, I'm just one reason for the moment would do.
Some of it is people who are, from particular fringe groups who haven't been involved in political parties. Some of it, and with those people, often it's really virulent anti-Semitism.
Okay.
Sometimes it's people who just aren't sure of truth because they get a lot of their news from, crank sources.
All right.
There are all sorts of reasons.
Well, we should say that we did ask the Labour Party to come on to today's show because they have knocked back on the Panorama show quite strongly and they've issued other statements too. And we wanted to be able to reflect that and debate and analyse that with them, but they wouldn't put anybody up for today's Politics Live. I want to show you now a testimony from Panorama last night from a young man who was involved in trying to deal with this avalanche, I think it's fair to call it, of anti-Semitic complaints within the Labour Party and how it affected him personally. His name is Sam Matthews. He was a key figure in this whole process of trying to deal with anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. This is what he had to say.
Elements among certainly in the leader's office that regarded us and our team as Blairites who are working to undermine the leader of the Labour Party. And now suddenly our boss is someone who has openly accused members of my team of being politically motivated, of not investigating complaints against Blairites, but investigating complaints against supporters of Jeremy. And this all created an environment and a culture that meant that the mental health of me and my team went through the floor.
So, Don Foster, this is a party that prides itself in anti-racism. It's a party that is the first to call out bad employers of harassment and bullying. And here we have a young man who was driven to thoughts about suicide working for the Labour Party. What do you think of that?
I think that the Labour Party should have, procedures in place that stop workplace stresses. Often they don't because, like any political party, they're constantly under-resourcing themselves in an effort to try and save money. And obviously, and under Jenny Formby, the number of staff in the complaints in the complaints department has doubled. And
but the complaints have more than doubled.
Not under Jenny Formby, no. Since
oh yes, complaints have more than doubled. I mean, they're rising all the time.
Since when?
Since 2015.
OK, but Jenny Formby came in last year. I'm saying that the number of staff has doubled in the last year.
To deal with the backlog?
Yes, and since then, the number of complaints dealt with has risen fourfold. And that was brought in because there was a huge backlog. There were too few staff, and the Labour Party are addressing it. They could do more. I think workplace stress should always be completely dealt with. But at the same time, this is an ongoing problem, and until the backlog is dealt with, staff will feel stressed.
Well, the Panorama programme claimed that Labour's General Secretary, Jenny Formby, tried to influence. This is one of the key complaints, that she actually tried to influence. Although the party said the complaints procedure was entirely independent, would do its own work without influence from other party officials or the leader of the opposition and his office, she tried to influence, said Panorama, the makeup of the panel investigating a former Labour activist, Jackie Walker. She was expelled later from the party for anti-Semitic behaviour. Let's just see that.
On the 5th of May 2018, Mr Corbyn's closest advisers discussed how they might exercise some control over the NCC.
This email chain, which includes some of Mr Corbyn's closest advisers, reveals what appears to have been an attempt to interfere with the selection of the NCC panel hearing the Jackie Walker case. One message from the General Secretary, Jenny Formby, says, and I quote,
"The NCC cannot be allowed to continue in the way that they are at the moment, and I will also be challenging the panel for the Jackie Walker case."
And the NCC was the body within the Labour Party tasked with dealing with these complaints of anti-Semitism. David Aaronovitch, what do you make of that?
Well, one of the things that Labour's imported with Jenny Formby and with some of the Corbynites is some of the worst practices that have come in from some British trades unions. Trades unions are on the whole a very positive thing, but there is a kind of bureaucratisation, and there's also a kind of position game that you play in order to get your people on committees. You've got to remember that most union members don't take a fantastic level of interest in the minutiae of politics. So getting your people onto the policy committees and so on to influence Labour and so on is a very important thing that unions have done. Jenny Formby comes very much from that tradition.
Does it leave you, though, in any doubt or other doubts that she was trying to influence the composition of the committee that was dealing with this high profile?
I would have been amazed if she hadn't been trying to do that. It would have been absolutely extraordinary and out of character for that section of the party, and for actually other sections of the party for that matter, not to try and influence it on their behalf. And the thing I think they've got to remember is that behind this is the politics of it. The kind of people, by and large, that we are talking about getting caught up in the disciplinary trap are the sorts of people who have been Jeremy Corbyn's greatest supporters and friends for 30 years.
What would you say to that?
I don't know the makeup of the entirety of those people. I mean, I'd say that, yes, Jenny Formby did say that she would, go to the NCC, and that was to speed up the fact that the NCC was the cause of most of the backlogs. And also try and get the Jackie Walker case heard earlier, which had dragged on for ages.
Well, she was doing it to try and get it heard earlier.
Yes.
She was trying to help the case.
Well, she said she wanted it sped up, and it was sped up, and she was expelled.
So why was she trying to change the composition of the committee as well?
Because there'd been three very high-profile cases that had led to expulsion before, and Labour were, and people I spoke to were worried that if the same composition was held again, then there may be ramifications for possible legal fight back from Jackie Walker.
I don't understand that. You're saying that the NCC had dealt with some high-level cases, had found that the anti-Semitic complaints were justified. It was now onto this, one of the most high-profile, and she's trying to change the composition of the committee. How does that help?
Because if you have the same committee every time, then it opens you to allegations of bias, from grasping, possible legal ramifications.
Do you buy that, David Aronovich?
It's puzzling, really, because you would have thought that if you changed the composition of the committee for a particular case, then in that case somebody would have a complaint on the basis that you changed the committee just for them, and so on. But I do buy the argument that it's quite possible by then they decided they had to throw Jackie Walker to what they would regard as the wolves, and it is entirely possible that at this point Formby is trying to speed the thing up so that they can get it out of the way.
If that's what she was trying to do, why did she then permanently delete these emails?
She deleted the one in question because she currently had a member of staff who had worked for the previous administration who was hostile and didn't want those emails falling into the wrong hands, and lo and behold they did, proving her point.
Can you just run that through me again? She deleted it because of what?
Because one disgruntled member of staff still had access to her email inbox, left shortly afterwards. She was worried.
Well, sure, why didn't she just move them? These were important emails to your mind. It was an attempt in your mind to help speed things up, get this done. Why didn't she just move them to a secure inbox?
Because lots of people had access to her inbox.
But you can create a secure inbox which has got its own password.
You clearly know more about the Labour Party's internal email address than I do. But she was worried this would fall to this email would fall to a disgruntled member of staff, and that was proven.
The Labour Party has given us a quote. It says, "We completely reject any claim that Labour is anti-Semitic. We stand in solidarity with Jewish people, and we're taking decisive action to root out anti-Semitism from our movement and society. The Panorama programme was not a fair or balanced investigation. It was a seriously inaccurate, politically one-sided polemic which breached basic journalistic standards, invented quotes and edited emails to change their meaning. It was an overtly biased intervention by the BBC in party political controversy." Do you know John Ware, the reporter?
No, but I've read a lot of his articles about Islam in the past, and I've never been a big fan of them, to be honest.
You don't think he's one of the country's finest investigative reporters?
Not when it comes to matters on Islam, for instance, which he said could be seen as rational, whereas anti-Semitism never was. I think neither of them are ever rational, and he takes the same line as Melanie Phillips, who I also think
in what way was his report seriously inaccurate?
So first of all, as previously mentioned, that there were the discussions on Jenny Formby's email. He also claimed that Seamus Milne had tried to intervene on to prevent somebody being investigated, and it, very, very seriously edited one of Seamus Milne's emails to take out the fact that he was discussing a Jewish member of the Labour Party, saying that we have to be careful if we are more often accusing Jewish members of being anti-Semitic when they are.
One reading of it.
Did you read the whole quote, David?
I did read the whole quote, yes. And actually, funnily enough...
Well, I'm sure Andrew has it there for us.
Sorry, the whole quote is more damaging, I think, to Seamus Milne than the edited quote, because it quite clearly says that what he's trying to say is we can't have the position whereby, or isn't it ludicrous, whereby you are accusing Jews of anti-Semitism. That's what it means. Hold on.
In more than a few cases.
Yes, but there will be quite a few cases because many of these friends of Jeremy Corbyn that I've been talking about, the great long supporters, etc., are people who are Jewish and so on, but who hold a contrary view to what I would say the substantial majority of the Jewish community does. This is one of the points, and some of them were definitely, as Jackie Walker's instance, because she has Jewish origins, have been caught up in this particular thread, and that's what Milne, I think, was talking about. And the answer to the question, which is not being delivered, is it possible for a Jew to be anti-Semitic, is I'm afraid that it is.
Well, of course it is, and Seamus Milne's email says that.
It's part of a much wider strategy of attempting to kind of create sort of, as it were, the good Jews who are willing to utterly abandon any connection with the State of Israel, and the bad Jews, which is the vast majority, who are not willing to do that. And we also heard last night about how the word Zionist has been seamlessly replaced with the word Jew, so that you can get away with, you essentially say the same things about Jewish people, but replacing it with the word Zionist, and therefore it's completely allowed according to their rules. It's just, it goes an awful lot further than just this one email, I think.
Well, the BBC has issued a statement in response to the Labour Party. It says the BBC stands by its journalism. We completely reject any accusations of bias or dishonesty. John Ware is a highly experienced and respected investigative journalist whose track record includes critically acclaimed and award-winning reports. We reject any claims Panorama took any of the evidence out of context. The significance of the email from Seamus Milne is that it showed one of the most powerful figures in the Labour Party, he works for Mr Corbyn, expressing concern about the handling of anti-Semitism complaints and suggesting the wider process should be reviewed. This goes contrary to the Labour Party's claims that this process was independent of the leader's office. The impact of this email on those dealing with the complaints process was made clear in the eyewitness testimony shown in the programme. It's interesting that Labour's now attacking John Ware when it wasn't that long ago they were putting down early day motions praising his journalism.
I don't know when that was.
Labour Party, Mr Corbyn. He's a great journalist when he's investigating things you want to be investigated, but not such a great journalist when he unearths things that you don't want to be unearthed.
I can't think of a documentary I've watched by him that I don't feel has been unbiased. He did a documentary on Corbyn in 2015, interviewed Diane Abbott at length, and then didn't use a word she'd said, because it didn't fit the narrative.
I've been involved in documentaries where you do interviews, but in the end they hit the cutting room floor. No, it's not a matter of bias. That's how documentaries are made.
And also, what Labour haven't disputed is that only 15 members have been expelled. A key finding of that programme is not disputed by Labour.
All right, it's an ongoing story. I think the interesting thing is that the Panorama programme, and perhaps even a lot of the backup stuff that helped make the programme, is being handled to the Equality and Human Rights Commission as part of the evidence it will take. So I think, in a way, this commission, very powerful commission, unprecedented for a mainstream political party to be investigated by it, we will see what the quality of Panorama's journalism is. I have an idea myself what that will be, but let's wait and see, because that will be a good test of it. Let's move on to the ongoing row between Britain and the United States as a result of these leaked cables. And it's now become an argument now that our man in Washington has resigned as a result of all the row as to who should choose the next ambassador. Should Mrs May do so before she steps down? Or should she wait until the next leader of the Conservative Party is chosen, which is only going to be in a couple of weeks' time? Is there really any need to rush into choosing a new ambassador? I mean, the dog days of summer have already begun in Washington. It's already started to empty out.
I'd certainly prefer that this decision was one for the next Prime Minister rather than the current Prime Minister, but I think it's certainly within Mrs May's powers to appoint a new ambassador if she chooses to do that.
But would it be unseemly for her to be seen to be appointing a new ambassador with only 2 weeks to go, to be appointing somebody who will not be her ambassador in 2 weeks' time? What is the rush? I mean, ambassadors are not as important as they used to be. As I say, it's July, it's a miserable time. They're all off to Martha's Vineyard already to escape the swampy heat. Why do we need an ambassador for 2 weeks?
Well, I suspect there may be a desire within Theresa May's team to leave an imprint on her time in office. There's been already quite a few legacy hunting efforts, new legislations, the zero emissions target, various bits of legislation. I think the hope is that she will be able to define her term as something other than making a complete hash of Brexit. I mean, I think that's quite an unwise aim, quite impractical.
But her term's not good to be defined by whoever she chooses to be the next
No,
ambassador.
but I think she would perhaps want to be seen as marking an opposition towards the likely next Prime Minister in choosing someone who is, less aligned with Donald Trump, to be seen to be taking a stand for UK interests in the civil service ahead of the likelihood of a next trade deal.
Well, it's become a headline. Let's look at the Daily Johnson. The Daily Telegraph. Well, same thing, really, these days. Boris must choose our new man in Washington, is the quote. Would it be inappropriate? I mean, I see why this is an argument.
Is that a quote from Boris?
I'm not sure who that's a quote from. It's your paper. Who's that a quote from? I think it's a quote from one of his allies. You know,
a source very close, remarkably close to Boris Johnson.
Nameless ally. It's called Milo Johnson, perhaps, or something like that. Stanley Johnson, perhaps. The argument here, the people who want Mrs May to choose it think they'll get more of a kind of career diplomat tradition. The people who want to wait for Boris think that he'll choose a more Brexiteer type of ambassador. Would it really be appropriate for Mrs May to appoint an ambassador now?
We have a problem, actually, which is that if we wait for Boris to appoint the ambassador, because of the very reasons that you've suggested, whoever that person is, they will be seen by people as being somebody who's been put there to creep up the backside of Donald Trump at the behest of Boris Johnson in order to sell whatever version of Brexit he manages to come to by the end of October.
But that's often been the case of ambassadors. We've put in Harold Wilson, put in John Freeman. In the United States.
Peter Jay.
Peter Jay was put in to, I won't use your metaphor, but to be very cosy with the Carter administration.
Yeah, no, it wouldn't be totally unprecedented, but it might be safer for the reputation, and especially, I mean, I imagine the state of the Foreign Office and Civil Service at the moment is very close to mutinous, and we have all kinds of reasons why that would be the case. People have not enjoyed, by and large, working for Boris Johnson at the Foreign Office and so on. And so it might seem to be politic for Theresa May to solve the problem for him by putting somebody in position before he gets there.
What do you make of this, Don Foster? Would Mrs May be right? She would be within her powers to do so, but would she be right to do so? Or should she, given that she is even more than a lame duck, she's in the departure lounge of prime ministers now, should she leave it to her successor, whoever that is?
I mean, Cameron put in a new ambassador in the dying days of
into
his
France.
reign. Yep.
Which was something of a political appointment too.
Yeah, I mean, all appointments are political appointments. I think the problem at the moment is if we leave it to Boris Johnson, then we are essentially signalling that the civil service and any form of possible kind of protection they may have is completely, thrown to the wind. From prime ministers, from outside sources, from the president's late night tweeting, any pretense we have at any form of impartiality is completely gone, and it means that future civil servants will be very, very nervous about what they can say on diplomatic cables.
But the Washington Post, in particular, has regularly been a political appointment. I mean, most of our ambassadorial appointments are diplomatic appointments, unlike the Americans who traditionally, for the big appointments, don't put in career diplomats. London in many ways, has been a particular victim of that. We've had some...
Certainly is now.
Low-grade ambassadors, I'd say nothing about the current one, but we've had some low-grade ambassadors from Democrats and Republicans, but they were there because they had been big donors to whoever had won the White House. We've not gone that route overwhelmingly, except for Washington, which has, for example, as David had mentioned, we've been talking about, it has been more than others a political appointment. So it wouldn't be beyond the norm to put in a political appointment.
No, it wouldn't. But equally, like leaving it to a complete and utter clown like Boris Johnson, as Theresa Sports.
Yeah, but that's, you call him a clown. But the point is, if he becomes the Prime Minister, it's his job. It's within his right to appoint the British ambassador to our most important ally.
And it's Theresa May's job as Prime Minister at the moment to also do it. But we just said that she was within her right to do so.
She's within her right, but would it be proper, given that she's gone in 2 weeks?
I think so. You asked my opinion,
Why?
I'm just giving it to you.
But you're only saying, if there was any prospect that Theresa May was going to appoint Nigel Farage as our ambassador, you would be against it immediately.
Maybe, maybe not.
Oh,
but I mean,
really? You'd be in favour of it?
I mean, if you don't want my opinion, move on to Theresa. We all know. We can guess what that will be.
If Boris is the next Prime Minister, there is no reason whatsoever to believe that he would appoint some, eccentric, inappropriate candidate as Washington
I'm sure that wouldn't
ambassador.
happen.
Really? There's no evidence for that at all.
No.
Yeah, we have. I'm sure. If Boris is the next Prime Minister and if the post remains unfilled at that stage, he would appoint an appropriate candidate.
Right, but should he, in your view, appoint another career diplomat like Kim Darroch, or should he make it a political appointment like Peter Jay in the late 70s?
I mean, my personal view is to stick with the career diplomat, but as you say, Washington is a post which in the past has sometimes been a more political appointment. There will be a range of strong candidates within the Foreign Service.
Who would be the strongest non-diplomatic candidate in your view?
I wouldn't be able to say. I haven't got any names to put forward at this stage.
Who should be our man or woman in Washington?
I haven't the foggiest, but I think it has to be someone who could do a good job of working with the States. That's utterly essential, and that's why, as soon as, unfortunately, that disastrous leak happened, his job had to be over at that point, because once the president can no longer work with our man in Washington, then his post is redundant. And awful as the leak was, that is the reality of the matter.
I think that would be a better reason for the Americans to impeach and remove Trump in many ways, as the origin of this problem. And his attack on Theresa May, incidentally, as collateral for his attack on the ambassador. We need to recall just how unprecedented all this has been. And we need to worry that if people see essentially such behaviour rewarded by somebody like Trump, it may become much closer to the new norm of the way in which leaders...
the French ambassador.
Well, for sure, but then other leaders in other countries may very well decide that they can afford to do the same. I mean, the Chinese and others. So
I bet you he doesn't have a go at the Russian ambassador.
Very nice to meet you.
All right. Well, tomorrow at 7 o'clock, 7 p.m. on BBC One, you can see my interviews with the two Conservative Party leadership contenders, Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson. BBC One, 7 o'clock. Now, some of the biggest names on the high street, Debenhams, Boots, Marks and Sparks, are closing stores, and it's got a lot to do with people buying more and more stuff online. Our reporter Greg Dawson has been to York to see what impact online shopping is having there. He also visits one of Britain's high streets of the year, which is just 10 minutes outside York's city walls, to see how they are fighting back.
How's your day been? Are you up to much? Has been replaced with a swipe and a touch? See you later, have a nice day has been replaced with a digital display.
What does the future hold for the UK high street? With more of us choosing clicks for our shopping than bricks, it's estimated 1 in 10 UK stores stands vacant.
Well, compared with other high streets across the country, York looks like it's thriving, and obviously its history helps it bring in millions of tourists each year. But even here, there are the signs of the wider problems affecting the high street.
You need the big brands because people still need to buy those staple products. So they need to come into Marks & Spencer's to buy a few sandwiches, that kind of thing. So we do need those extra few products and extra few shops.
As well as selling soft drink potions at his shop in the city centre, Phil Pinder also runs the York Retail Forum.
Coney Street has got some very big problems. Probably the biggest one to kind of like put most people off is the rents. It's our dearest kind of per square foot retail space in York, but at the minute we've got many empty shops on there. Landlords have to get realistic and realise that their assets are going to have to take a hit on the thing to lower the rents to get the people back in.
Instead of talking to another human being, buttons and screens is what we're seeing. It's like using our contactless is making us contact less.
The major impact in the last few years, which is completely altering the scene, is the impact of people buying online.
Johnny Hayes has owned several independent businesses in York and is now pitching his solutions to try and regenerate the high street here.
Well, here we've got British Home Stores as was, next to a smaller shop. Well, BHS, they're certainly not going to be coming back. But then you look up, and when you look up, what you see, 3 empty void spaces above, all of which are perfectly reasonably rentable, then that will obviously reduce the costs for the people on the ground floor.
Last year, the government announced a £675 million fund to help revitalise town centres across England. Local authorities bidding for cash are being encouraged to create community hubs instead of focusing solely on shopping.
Once you lose a major store, we're outside Woolworths. Woolworths is well and truly gone. These big boys, they will not be back. We have to come up with a new reality. We have to start thinking about the way that we're using these buildings, the way that city centres are actually presenting themselves, and look to the future.
Just outside the city centre is a high street regarded by some as a template for the future.
I think it's going an extra mile for people that really brings everybody together. We just had, last week we had our street party, we had over 4,000 people here.
Bishy Road, it's more than just the retail aspect. It's very much a community and how the businesses interact with the people who live in the area.
I think we're thriving because the community that lives around here and the shopkeeper, a nice words I like to use, collaborate between each other.
Bishopthorpe Road, Bishy Road to the locals, was in trouble in 2008 when 1 in 5 shops was closed. But businesses worked together to reverse the decline and it was named British High Street of the Year.
The place looked a little bit old and a little bit shabby.
What do you think other high streets can learn from the success of this place?
People's shopping habits change, people's living habits change. So the high street now reflects that. Now the high street is more about experience. Here, customers of one place will be recommended to go to another. There is a conscious effort with some businesses not to replicate.
With the focus on customer service and social contact, businesses here believe they're offering something online retail can't compete with.
For people, there's always a choice. There's a choice. They can vote with their feet. And for Bishy Road particularly, you know, it's footfall that is really important. And so, yeah, we can't be complacent.
So the future of our high street. Is it inevitable now that if your primary purpose is value and price sensitivity, you want to get what you know you want and you want it as cheap as you can, you're either going to do that online or you go to a big shopping mall where scale makes the unit cost cheaper? And that the high street's future now is almost as a kind of boutique shopping experience, a little bit chic, a bit bourgeois, and that's inevitable the way it's going.
Well, perhaps that might very well be the case, but I don't think it necessarily need to be a bad thing. I mean, we heard in the video about people who are already trying to potentially repurpose their stores to tap into what we call the experience economy, which is in line with what we know of shopping habits, which is that people increasingly favour, you know, going for coffee, doing some yoga, as well as buying some things. It's possible to do both at once, but I agree with you.
You can have coffee and yoga.
Well, let's say you
go
to a yoga shop, buy some. I don't do yoga personally, but I'm told that you can. There are these shops where you go and buy your yoga stuff, and then you can do a yoga class afterwards, and that's the kind of.
That's what I mean. It's sort of bourgeois and chic.
Well, it is a little bourgeois and chic, but I also
I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's
a little.
You know, if you want to get your flat screen TV, you're going to go to
I think
Westfield.
the government.
Other big shopping malls are available. Don, how do you shop?
I shop online about once or twice a year.
Just once or twice a year?
Yeah, I'm the worst millennial. I really like shopping in person.
And when you do shop in person, then do you go to the high street or do you go to these big shopping emporiums?
I go to a small high street near me in Clapham Junction, and I know exactly what type of shops are there, and I know exactly what I can get there.
And has that survived? Has that adapted to become more like the bespoke individual shop high streets? Or does it still have the big chains?
Some have. So there are still quite a few big chains, but there are a couple of like smaller shops as well. The one thing I have noticed is that some of the kind of shops you saw a lot in the 90s, so like discount, shoe shops, smaller chains have gone bust. And the big Debenhams is always obviously, under threat of going bust.
Yes.
There is some change, and there has been some change since I lived there. But it's still relatively busy, and I think that's partly because it's next to a big transport
there are
hub.
Successful.
But
and it is a big transport hub. People can come into it easily.
And there's a lot of coffee shops nearby as well. So.
Is there a yoga shop? Have you seen a yoga shop?
There's a Sports Direct. I'm not sure about yoga shop.
Not sure that's yoga. Is this just an inevitable economic development? Should we just leave this to market forces? These are people voting with their feet or voting with their keyboard. Or should government have a policy to do something about the high street?
Government definitely does have a policy to support the high street. It's got a 675 million Help for High Streets fund. It has helped with business rates. So there is something we can do. But obviously, the economic pressure to shift online, because it is often so much cheaper, has had a pretty devastating effect on retail in high streets. So, I mean, one of the things we can do is try and ensure that high streets are more compact, so that there's a mix of retail with perhaps office space as well, and to get more people living in high streets, as your package said.
But in some cities now, you've seen I mean, for many years gone by, the big demographic story was the flight from the city to the suburbs, and then what America called the exurbs, further away than the suburbs. In lots of places like Manchester, Leeds, inner city Glasgow, and so on. London, you mentioning the Clapham area, you see a return. People want to be Shoreditch. People want to be there in the city. The French are about to introduce a 3% tax on the revenue of big tech companies who often benefit from online. And indeed, the French Parliament, I've told, because we have a hotline into the National Assembly at all times in Paris, has approved it, 3%. Is that one way of dealing with it?
I can't see how that would work. I mean, all you would do is push up the prices of the online online stuff by not enough to outdo the convenience of shopping online. So what would you, and then what would you actually do with the money? Now, I suppose you could take down the costs of the high street businesses. You could have somebody coming out with a bit of kind of largesse and some kind of formula whereby you doled it all back out again. But that doesn't seem to be the problem. The problem does seem to be that people now shop in a different way from the way they did before, and anticipating the things that they will want in the high street. And I think, the film did show some of the ways in which that might happen. Is going with how people alter their behaviour and their desires. And lamenting their change in behaviour and desires really doesn't do as much good.
Well, Mr. Trump has ordered investigation into this tax in France, and it's being said that his trade representative said that it could lead to retaliatory tariffs. So it won't be long before we're reading the French ambassador's cables as well.
If we tax Google here now, he's going to have retaliatory tariffs.
So there we go. Every story has consequences. Now, Labour have been in touch with the Labour Party about our earlier discussion on anti-Semitism. Good to know they're watching the programme, even if they wouldn't give us anybody to interview. They say that they have, in fact, disputed how many people have been expelled from the party because of anti-Semitism, although they don't give an alternative figure. Panorama said 15 people have been expelled, so we're happy to make that clear, and we'd welcome it if the Labour Party could actually come on to the show instead of just watching the box and elucidate these figures for us.
Or just give a figure of their own.
Well, either would be... Well, I'd prefer them to come on and give a figure. So, I'm greedy. We'd like to have both on that. Right. We're just waiting on Mel Stride to come on from Parliament to talk about bullying and harassment, because we've had an independent inquiry led by Gemma White QC into allegations of this bullying and sexual harassment of MP staff. But we had one on the Cox report, that was about harassment of apolitical staff, and we had the Ellenbogen report yesterday, which was focus was on the Lords. Theresa Villiers, why is this almost like a perennial problem in Parliament? Why can't Parliament get its house in order and set an example?
Well, Parliament is trying to deal with it, but these reports demonstrate that we need to go further to grip this, to make sure that we stamp out these kind of unacceptable practices so that we maintain the same standards as we expect of other workplaces in the UK.
Well, because you're always lecturing us on how we should behave, but it doesn't seem you behave very well yourself. It also doesn't seem that you take much remedial action. For example, there is some voluntary valuing everyone training available to try and educate people, I guess, into not behaving in this way. Only 34 out of 650 MPs have volunteered to go on that. I'll say that again, 34 out of 650, that's about 5%. And out of MPs' staff, there are 3,200 folks working for MPs. I wonder what they all do. Anyway, 3,200, only 135 have volunteered. It would be an idea, perhaps, Don, given that's so few, and given that this is a perennial problem. I mean, the report this morning is quite devastating in places. Maybe this sort of training ought to be compulsory.
I think training should be, but I think training is still only a very small part of the problem.
You don't think it would address the cultural issues behind it?
No, I think there are two big things that would. And first, that's changing the way that people are employed so that their boss isn't necessarily their MP, which means that when they have a problem, there is somebody they can go to. And the second is having proper disciplinary procedures, independent, so that when you have a problem, if it's your boss or somebody in your office, groping you, victimising you, you have somewhere to go where you don't have to worry about your employment and you know it will be dealt with properly.
All right, well, let's go to Mel Stride now. He's the leader of the Commons. He'll be dealing with this report. Mel Stride, yet another report in some ways, though in more detail, telling us what we know already. It concludes bullying and harassment continues among a minority of MPs despite the introduction of a new code of conduct. Indeed, it says that the new complaints procedure, it's not that old, set up by your predecessor, it describes that as career suicide. What do you say to that?
Well, I think the report actually says that the new grievance process is actually a step in the right direction, and I think that's the important point. There is a direction of travel here. About a year ago we brought that in, and the House just now, actually, I've announced there'll be a motion in the House of Commons next week which will broaden the scope of the grievance scheme that we have brought in. But I think it's also important to reflect that the report does indeed highlight a number of instances on an anonymised basis of behaviour that is totally and utterly unacceptable. And we accept that, and the House accepts that, and that's spurring us on to do even more. But at the same time, the report also recognises that most MPs actually do behave appropriately and do treat their staff and the people that they work with respect.
Sure, but there is clearly a minority problem, and it may be quite a big minority problem. Would we have a sense that you were finally taking this seriously if there was a proper investigation into the behaviour of the Speaker?
Well, I'm not going to get involved or drawn into the specifics of any particular individual. What matters here is firstly that we have a culture in which people feel they're able to come forward with confidence. Secondly, that we have a... Well, let me just finish, because I think that what drives their confidence is having a bedded-in process. And we have two helplines, for example, one for bullying and harassment and one specifically for sexual harassment, so that they can get the support that they need, they can make their complaint, that we have trained assessors who then take the cases from there, and that we thoroughly investigate all those appropriate cases that come forward. Now, it's relatively early days, but what the statistics show actually is that about 50 members of staff came forward in the first quarter of the operation of this scheme, but that has now grown to about 300. So the evidence seems to be suggesting that there is now at least greater engagement in the process.
All right.
But we don't stand still, we will keep working on it.
OK, we need to leave it there. I'm sorry to cut you short. I know you were delayed in the House. That's it for today. I'll be back on BBC One slightly earlier time of 11:15 for the penultimate this week. How could you miss that?
Right, chaps and chapesses, that was what was that, program 2. Up next is program 3. This is going out to Debreeze. Yeah. She or he has waited since Tuesday. So I'm going to do Tuesdays next. Then after that, I'm going to do today's one. And then we go to hustings. So yeah, busy boy. I'll be back in about 2 minutes. I've got to let the stream die, etc. So it doesn't rename the past show. See you in a minute.